Okay, this is episode 7, the first part. I say first part, anticipating that there may be another, but there may not be. Part 7, or episode 7, I'm going to title this The Kevod of God, of Yahweh. The Kevod of Yahweh. This is where the rubber really starts to hit the road, to meet the road. And since these chapters are relatively short, I'm going to depart from my normal routine, which has been to only quote him when I have to, really, when he's highlighting something important or when he's translating a verse, and read more of this chapter. Probably, I'm going to read probably 75% of this chapter, but these chapters are short. But I'll be probably continuing, obviously, to insert comments if need be. This is a very important chapter because he's talking about the glory of God here and how Kevod has been wrongly interpreted by theologians who are coming at the text with their own presuppositions, imposing meanings on the Hebrew text that the literal translation will not countenance. And he's going to discuss in detail a fairly an essential text for Christians, for sure, who are more mystically oriented. So definitely in the Eastern Church and even parts of the Catholic Church, Exodus 33, where the Kevod or glory of God descends upon the mountain where Moses goes to meet him, and he hides himself in the cleft of the rocks, and he only shows his hind parts to Moses. This has been the subject of so much in-depth mystical commentary and elaboration. And what he wants to show here is that this has a far more simple meaning, and you don't need to get into these complex theological monologues about cataphatic and apophatic theology, mysticism, what the dark means and what the darkness of God represents, or all of this, okay? And then he's going to talk about the covenant. The very concept of the covenant takes a very different meaning when we understand it in light of there being a group of plural Elohim who made pacts with the various nations on earth at that time. Covenants would have been a very natural thing, and they were not just made with the Jews, and they weren't just made by a particular God, Yahweh, for his special people, the Jews. This was a very common thing. Covenants were made, pacts were made between the various Elohim and their people, their nations, among the 70 nations, the table of nations. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get started with it instead of this me continuing on with this introductory commentary here. He says, we must say that the glory of God is a concept not easily understood. It has several meanings related to each other, but that are also interdependent. So and then he provides with the Hebrew symbols, a term here in Hebrew. Is the Hebrew term alternately readable as either kavod / kabod, so you can spell it with a V as in violin, or B as in boy, or kavod with an A instead of an E, kavod and kabod. It derives from a verb indicating the concepts of to be relevant, to have importance, to be honored, or to be tough. The adjective kabed identifies what is heavy, grievous, difficult, important, honored, but also insensitive or hard-hearted. Greeks have translated this term with the word doxa, D-O-X-A, which in turn has been translated in the modern languages with glory. The translation of this term has always been influenced by a divinity representation that, as we have seen, does not correspond at all to the Elohim's description in the Old Testament. Elohims were in fact anything but spiritual beings. The fanciful theological elaboration has totally twisted the meaning of the term in order to make it the representation of deity, a deity immanence, and make it parallel with the concept of sanctity. Here, the translation of the concept of glory means something quite different. This change in meaning is due to the need felt by theologians to find a way to reconcile the term Kevod with the idea of God they have artificially elaborated. In fact, the root consonant, Hebrew root consonant, refers very clearly to the concepts of being heavy, tough, strong. Strength and weight are thus two key aspects inherent to this term and fundamental to all words with this root. By extension, to be powerful also indicates being rich and therefore honored. In other words, the meanings of weight and honor were interpreted as attributes of God, seen as a spiritual and transcendent entity capable of becoming immanent when he chooses to reveal his presence to the faithful people. And he says that is bunk. That is the meaning theologians gave it, because they came to the text with their theological presuppositions, not simply allowing the original language to speak for itself, not interpreting it literally. So let's look at the passages of the Old Testament that talk about this glory and the way it manifests in man. I'm going to skip down a bit. Here he has a section on the covenant that is very important. I want to read this. He nestles it away in a box here to set it apart from the main narrative of the chapter. He says it's useful and interesting to recall that the expression Old Testament indicates a covenant. The old one, an agreement between an Elohim who proposed it and a people that accepted it. What is never sufficiently emphasized is that the people could choose to not subscribe to this covenant. They had no obligation to accept it. All commitments are born only after a second-party acceptance. In short, the Jews did not have the idea of God as a transcendent and unique entity, at least not at this time. And therefore, the relationship with him was not perceived as ineluctable. In other words, they could refuse any contract or commitment which was presented to them. The whole history of Israel is full of betrayals, abandonment, cults dedicated to other deities, also called Elohims, all concrete, all present, like the Elohim leading Israel, and with whom there had been this alliance. The Jews would serve him, and he would help them conquer the land and become a nation. The same Elohim repeatedly calls himself jealous, and we wonder, how can one be jealous of a partner if there are no rivals in the relationship, right? The covenant or pact provides for an exchange, a giving and a receiving, which only involves the two parties, at the expense of the people who were not included in this absolutely concrete and human alliance. The covenant provided for the exclusion of outsiders, even their total annihilation if necessary, in order to achieve the goals common to both Elohim and Israelites, to conquer and govern over a territory. Okay, that's why, of course, we have all these pro-genocide edicts given by Yahweh, asking his people who have already made the pact with Yahweh, a covenant, that they are to destroy the Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amalekites, and so on. After the first part of the conquest of Canaan, Joshua asks the people to freely choose whether to continue to serve the Elohim who was guiding them, or to serve other Elohims, all of which were real, present, concrete, and who provided potential places of worship and service. Only after the people had confirmed their choice to serve the same Elohim, who was called Yahweh, the covenant and commitments were confirmed. This contract, the covenant, had severe consequences if the agreement was broken. The choice was again absolutely free. There are no doubts, nor any need for interpretation in the text that tells us about the episode. All this is clearly written in chapter 24 of the book of Joshua, verses 14 through 25, a highly significant and little-known story underlining the concrete materiality of the facts in contrast with our traditional vision of the people of Israel and their relationship with God. So now we get back to the main text, where he wants to get into the actual scripture now, the Pentateuch, in Exodus chapter 33. Moses and his people were wandering in the desert, and at each resting place, Moses took the conference tent or meeting place and pitched it outside the camp. In fact, the text specifies in verse 7, far away from the camp. Okay, so the people couldn't see what was going on, or hear what was going on. They might have been able to see from a distance, but they wouldn't have been able to hear it, what was going on. Then whoever wanted to meet the Elohim had to reach this meeting place that was outside the camp. So the text underscores that the tent is away from the camp. Throughout the pilgrimage to the promised land, a column of smoke and clouds that overnight become a pillar of fire led the people, and when Moses wished to confer with the Elohim, he approached the meeting tent, entered it, and then in Exodus 33 verse 9, he gives the literal translation, the column of cloud descended and stood at the opening of the tent and spoke with Moses. This was not a strange sort of vision or imaginative representation made up in order to impress. That's clear as day. It was, in fact, a real description consistent with the rest of the story, in which all narrative characteristics are aimed at describing in detail what was happening without neglecting any details. So the next verse is verse 10 of Exodus 33. And all the people saw the column of cloud at the opening of the tent. So at this sight, the people would stand up and then prostrate, each one close by his own tent. Clearly at this conference place outside the tent, something reserved only for Moses happened. The others could watch only from a distance without approaching. On these occasions, Moses spoke to the Elohim who had descended in the tent. It was an utterly conventional, normal interview. And indeed, the two communicated. Exodus 33 verse 11, face to face as a man talks or would talk to his neighbor. Then there is the concrete wording that this Elohim used to move with, quote unquote, something that by day was as shrouded in the steam and at night was visible from the fire it produced. Once on the ground, the Elohim had regular colloquial meetings with Moses. But what was this something that was used to move? Now we get into the Kevod. The story of the meetings and talks between Moses and the Elohim continues by expressing Moses' doubts. This quote-unquote God gave Moses neither sufficient guarantees nor certainties. Then Moses actually asks him to lead the people on the way to the promised land and stresses that everyone needs to see very clearly that the Elohim is with them. Otherwise, there is no distinction between these people and any other people. The quote-unquote divine presence must be clearly visible. The Elohim understands the situation, agrees, and promises that he will do what Moses demands. Despite this promise, Moses then asks to see and touch the Kevod. So then he asks him in Exodus 33:18, please let me see what is on your Kevod. Therefore, Moses wants proof and asks the Elohim, since he is making promises of conquest, to see something that attests his physical presence. Moses needs some guarantees. He wants to talk to his people advisedly. If he is to convince or urge them to follow this Elohim instead of any others, he wants to be sure of what he is saying. This Elohim understands the need and agrees with Moses' request, but warns him that what is about to occur is extremely dangerous. It can also cause his death. Virtually, the glory of God, quote-unquote, that Moses asks to see can kill a man. This means that the glorious manifestation of divinity is potentially lethal. Does the outcome of spiritual transcendence kill? Isn't God able to control his power, we question? Apparently not, obviously not. This event cannot be dispensed or otherwise filtered. Okay, that's important to point out, because this would suggest, again, a high-tech device, not some spiritual vision, not a spiritual appearance, not a theophany. The Elohim can only provide guidance to control the effects of his glory, offset consequences, but not undo or mitigate them in advance. This quote-unquote glory necessarily acts with all its deadly power. If you think that Kevod is usually translated as glory, which is a very abstract concept, a kind of theological category, not easily definable, it becomes difficult to understand why the Elohim prepares the event of manifestation by giving Moses a series of operational guidelines and practices, very clearly and exclusively aimed at physically safeguarding him. Instead, this is exactly what happens. The Elohim gives Moses some practical guidelines and precise precautions. Years ago, I used to investigate fires, and occasionally I would accompany, this is me now talking, I would occasionally be on a scene that required hazmat suits, and I would have to undergo instruction by people in the know who dealt with the chemical or the property or the, you know, the fertilizer or whatever it might be that had potentially dangerous properties. I had to learn something about how it reacted under certain conditions and what I needed to do to be safe, right? I had to undergo safety procedures and precautions and things of that nature. And that's exactly what's happening here at the mountain with Moses. So here is a place close to me, and you will stand up against the rock, is the translation of Exodus 33:21. The indication is so colloquial and concrete as it seems we are watching the scene and the gesture of the arm indicating that very place. A sort of saying, stay here and try to keep firmly in place. Apparently this measure did not seem sufficient, considering that the Elohim adds a further recommendation in verse 22, and when my kavod passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my palm until I have passed by. We now wonder, what might this glory be that could only be seen from the back, but not directly? What was then passing by Moses so dangerous as to require a special protection? How could the Elohim protect Moses with the palm of his hand while it was passing by? The solution to these questions is in fact possible when presented in the light of what we are trying to demonstrate, which is the concreteness of the described event. It should be recalled that shortly before the Elohim uses the expression, a place nearby me, and shows Moses a cleft that evidently was placed nearby him and that would provide him with protection. The word kaf, hence the expression kapi, K-A-P-I, of the aforementioned verse also indicates a cavity, as the palm of the hollow hand. This is not all. Another meaning of the root kaf is rock. Its meaning in Hebrew is borrowed from Aramaic, therefore we can suppose, to overcome the traditional interpretative difficulties, thinking that the Elohim advises Moses to remain in the cleft of the rock and that he will repair or cover the cavity while passing. Summarizing, Yahweh agrees to show the kavod in action, and to do so without producing irreversible consequences for Moses, he orders him to take cover in the cleft of the rocks. Moreover, after this experience, followed by the delivery of the tablets of the law, okay, so the giving of the law is very much bound up with this. We're looking at the creation and transmission of a law system given by an off-planet entity to Moses on the mountain. So Moses has his face flushed, as burned, requiring to be constantly covered by a veil, which is only removed when he enters the tent before the Elohim. See Exodus 34:29. What has happened? Was he exposed to a powerful source of energy? Was he hit by a radiation, such as a solar one, that produces burns? By the way, we see the same thing. Burns like this reported in numerous accounts of extraterrestrial encounters. These effects, however, do not seem so strange if one considers that Exodus 24:15 through 17 says that when Moses climbs the mountain, the Elohim's Kevod stays on the top, producing a cloud covering it. And the cloud, verse 16, and the cloud, this is verse 15 of Exodus 24, covered the mountain. Verse 16, and the Kevod of Yahweh installed on the mountain. This verb installed indicates the very act of settling in order to abide or dwell. With this same meaning, the verb recurs several times in other passages of the Old Testament, and here the verb expresses the very act of placing, settling, and then abiding on the mountain. It seems to see an aircraft landing with great visual and spectacular effects. Let me read that again. He emphasizes this in italics. It seems to see an aircraft landing with great visual and spectacular effects. Actually, and then he provides the translation of verse 17, and view of Kevod of Yahweh was like devouring fire on top of the mount. This is what the Israelites did see from above. The Kevod appeared as fire or as a cloud. And the Elohim usually called Moses from the middle of this cloud. He puts cloud in quotes. It wasn't a literal cloud, in which Moses then entered. So this is a description of a concrete and evident physical event, a phenomenon taking place before everyone's eyes and observable even from the valley below. Particularly impressive is the so-called, quote, theophany or appearance of God described in chapter 19, when the Elohim manifests on the mountain along with seemingly terrifying phenomena, thunder, flashes of light, and a loud and prolonged sound similar to a trumpet. On that occasion, before the Israelites' terrified eyes, Mount Sinai, Exodus 19:18, quote, literal translation of the verse, it smoked from all faces because Yahweh descended on it in fire. These descriptions are too detailed to be interpreted as visions or memories of atmospheric phenomena, which nomads were certainly used to, nor can it be interpreted as a naive desire to make up some form of appearance aimed at amazing the reader. Religious literature has done much more in this sense. Here we are reading about extraordinary events witnessed by an entire group of people. This was a specific phenomenon, absolutely new to the ordinary experience of those people, consisting of images, sounds, and situations that, if for a moment we get rid of prejudices and freely follow the current thinking and knowledge, are caused by the presence of, quote-unquote, something that manifested very powerfully. Indeed, the term Kevod does identify this. What is heavy and strong? Today, kaved, the adjectival form, could be an airplane, a tank, a ship, an elephant, perhaps just the traveling machines used by the Anunnaki or Elohims. I'm only going to read part of this next section, and then we'll be pretty much finishing up with the chapter. One of the most important Jewish scholars, Rashi of Troy or Troyes, Troyes, 10th century AD, or we should say 10th century CE, commenting on the book of Genesis, he depicted a very realistic figure of the throne of glory of Yahweh, when he said that in origin, quote, it was suspended in the air and hovered over the face of the waters like a dove is suspended above its nest, and obeyed his command. This Jewish commentator also said that the quote-unquote glory was something external from God, an instrument God commanded and used to move. Doesn't it seem to describe the control panel of a flying object? Perhaps this realism was the reason why this passage was included among those which could/must be read and explained by a teacher only to those students deemed able to understand and accept them. This was a very esoteric point within esoteric Judaism, and not everyone was able to understand, and not everyone was mature enough to receive it. You had to undergo a special initiation. Okay, that's very important. And I think because this comes up in this book, it's going to be very important that when I'm finished with the book and I continue adding to the series, that I'm going to need to discuss Jewish Kabbalah, because there are some very esoteric doctrines connected with the Kabbalistic teaching coming out of the Zohar and other sources, rabbinic sources, that are very relevant to what we're discussing. And some are so secret because they would be very dangerous to them. I'm not going to use the J word from here on out, okay? I'm going to, just to be politically correct, because this is YouTube and I have to kind of be more politically correct, I'm going to use the phrase the tribe or the chosen, and you'll know who I'm talking about. There are certain teachings that are the most secret teachings, okay, outside of this understanding of who Yahweh actually was. One of a number of Elohim, some off-planet deity, but of course they see him as sort of the supreme deity of all the Elohim, who kind of stood at the top of the heap. He was the leader of the council, right? Because Yahweh gets merged with El in Old Testament theology. Beyond those types of things, but beyond that type of information, the most secretive teachings have nothing to do with mysticism or esoteric concepts. They have to do with the actual status that Gentiles have in the minds of the members of the Sanhedrin. Let's say, we'll use that term as well, or the tribe, the chosen. That status, if the masses, there are Gentiles aware of this, but if the masses were to get hold of it, their very existence would be under imminent threat. So it is of the utmost importance for the Sanhedrin to ensure that this information does not become mainstream, because it involves the eradication and annihilation of the population. And if given the opportunity, I want to cover a book that gets into this called by John Bjerknes, which a man who comments regularly under my videos actually has reviewed on his channel, and I recommend. I would go listen to Catholic Perennialist, his video on that. John Bjerknes wrote a book called Beware the World to Come, and that's going to factor into this series at some point. So he lists a bunch of points here that he's summarizing from the aforementioned that we've already covered. I'm not going to retrace those steps. And then he just summarizes, as you can see, when driven by prejudice and out of necessity, these scholars must give free rein to imagination and use the issues that best respond to their own personal need to represent the divine. It seems to us much easier to think that whomever wrote the texts has transposed on paper the story of real physical phenomena repeatedly witnessed by hundreds or thousands of people and then handed down over time, at least in its substantial aspects, albeit with all variations that oral transmission inevitably produces.